A guerrilla fighter walks 300 kilometers through jungle to free his homeland. The only farewell Seelan allowed himself was a ghost of a touch against the ancient bark of a kapok tree that marked the edge of his world. Behind him, the village of Oakhaven slept a troubled sleep under the heel of the invaders, its thatched roofs like bowed heads in the moonlight. A thread of unfamiliar, acrid smoke from the occupiers' barracks tainted the familiar scent of damp earth and night-blooming jasmine. He had no pack, only a water skin, a worn machete, and the coiled hope of rebellion sealed in a bamboo tube tucked inside his shirt. This tube held the maps, the rendezvous points, the spark that could relight the flame of his homeland. Before him lay the maw, the local name for the entrance to the verdant labyrinth, a jungle that had swallowed armies whole. Its breath was a humid wave of decay and life, thick and heavy. Taking a steadying breath, Kalen pushed aside a giant waxy leaf dripping with dew and stepped from the world of men into the world of shadow and thorn. The canopy closed instantly above him, a suffocating blanket that stole the moonlight and plunged him into a profound darkness. The air grew 10 degrees cooler, alive with the chittering, clicking, and humming of a million unseen things. This was the first of 300 kilometers. Every step from here was a step toward freedom, or a step into an unmarked grave. He gripped the smooth wood of his machete, its weight a familiar comfort in the overwhelming unknown. The journey had begun. For hours, Seelan moved through the oppressive blackness, becoming a creature of sound and touch. His feet learned to read the forest floor, the treacherous slip of wet roots, the soft give of moss, the sharp crackle of dry leaves that signaled a clearing. The jungle was a living thing, its nocturnal chorus a constant assault of clicks, hoots, and deep-throated croaks that vibrated through the soles of his feet. He ignored the phantom shapes that flickered in his peripheral vision, focusing only on the faint northward pull of the stars he glimpsed through rare breaks in the canopy. Then, a new sound bled into the symphony, a low, guttural rumble that grew steadily into a roar. He recognized it with a sinking feeling. The Serpent's Coil River. Fed by the early monsoon rains, it would be a churning, impassable torrent. When he reached its banks, his fears were confirmed. The river was a muddy beast, 3 times its usual width, greedily tearing at the banks and carrying entire branches in its current. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to find purchase in his heart, but he beat it back. Wasting time was not an option. He moved upstream, his eyes scanning the opposite bank. Half a kilometer on, he found his chance. A colossal ironwood tree, a casualty of some long-ago storm, formed a natural, albeit terrifying, bridge across the torrent. Its trunk, wider than his shoulders, was slick with moss and slicker still with the river's spray. With the precious bamboo tube clamped between his teeth, Seelan began to cross, one agonizingly slow step at a time, the world dissolving into the thunder of the water below and the precarious balance of the log beneath him. The adrenaline from the river crossing ebbed away, leaving a tremor in its wake. Seelan's legs felt heavy, his muscles screaming for rest. To push on now, through the deepest hours of the night, would be to invite a foolish mistake. The jungle punished the arrogant, and exhaustion was a form of arrogance. He would give the labyrinth its due. He moved away from the river's roar, venturing deeper into the forest until the sound was a distant whisper. There, he found what he was looking for, a colossal banyan tree, its tangle of aerial roots forming a natural fortress. With the practiced efficiency of a man raised in the wild, he set to work. His machete, an extension of his arm, sliced through thick liana vines, which he stripped and wove with nimble fingers. Within the hour, he had fashioned a simple but strong hammock, a jungle cradle, which he hauled high into the banyan's embrace, 20 feet above the forest floor. From his perch, shielded by a curtain of leaves, the jungle transformed. The ground, a place of slithering threats and grasping roots, was now a world away. The cacophony of unseen creatures became a lullaby. He allowed himself a single dry rice cake and a careful sip of water. Placing a hand over the bamboo tube against his chest, he felt the weight of his mission not as a burden, but as an anchor in the shifting, breathing darkness. He was a ghost in the trees, a patient seed of rebellion waiting for the dawn. Seelan awoke to a world of cathedral light. The morning sun had pierced the canopy, sending golden shafts down through the humid mist, illuminating dust motes and tiny, iridescent insects that danced in the beams. From his perch in the banyan, the forest floor looked like a mossy, emerald sea. The hoots and clicks of the night had been replaced by the melodic calls of unseen birds and the distant chatter of monkeys. For a fleeting moment, this was the jungle he knew as a boy, a place of wonder, not a place of refuge. The beauty of it settled in his chest, a sharp and painful reminder of what he was fighting for. Carefully, he descended to the damp earth, his senses sharp. After retrieving his meager supplies, he moved towards a small stream to refill his water skin. It was then he saw it, a glint of silver, jarring and alien against the green. He knelt. It was the foil wrapper from an invader's ration bar. Beside it, pressed deep into the mud, were the unmistakable prints of military boots, heavy, cleated, and brutal. He counted 3 distinct sets of tracks. A cold dread, far more chilling than the river's water, settled over him. He ran his fingers along the edge of a print. The mud was still soft, the edges sharp. They had passed in the last few hours. While he slept, the enemy had been within a stone's throw. The 300-kilometer trek had just become infinitely longer. He was not just racing the clock. He was now eluding hunters. For a moment, the predator in Keelan rose up, urging him to stalk the patrol, to become the hunter. It was a fierce, tempting instinct. But then his fingers brushed against the cool bamboo tube beneath his shirt. This message was the heart of the rebellion. His life was secondary to it. The fate of a single enemy patrol was meaningless. To engage would be an indulgence, and the jungle did not reward indulgence. He had to vanish. With the patience of a spider, he began to erase himself. He carefully brushed away his prints near the stream with a large fern leaf, disturbing the ground just enough to mimic natural leaf litter. Then, stepping backward into the shallow water, he waded downstream for 100 meters, letting the current pull his scent away. He finally emerged onto a jumble of slick, granite boulders, leaving no trace that a man had ever passed. He abandoned the faint game trail he had been following and turned his face toward the rugged hills, towards a stretch of land his people called the Razor-Thorn Thicket. It was a brutal, unforgiving place, a snarled upland where thorny vines grew as thick as a man's arm, and the ground was a treacherous carpet of sharp stones and ankle-twisting roots. Progress would be agonizingly slow, but it was a path the invaders, with their loud gear and heavy boots, would never take. With a grim set to his jaw, he pushed his way into the grasping thorns, the thicket immediately tearing at his clothes and skin, each step forward a small, painful victory. For hours, the world was reduced to a green and brown prison. The razor-thorn thicket was relentless, a living maze designed to punish passage. Sweat dripped from Seelan's brow, stinging his eyes, while his arms and shoulders burned with the effort of hacking a path with his machete. The air was stagnant and thick, vibrating with the drone of insects. Each step was a battle against grasping vines and sharp-edged leaves. The monotony of the struggle was a danger in itself, lulling the senses into a dull, aching rhythm. It was a moment of fatigue-induced carelessness. While trying to pry his way around a gnarled wall of thorns, his boot slipped on a patch of wet, hidden scree. He twisted to catch his balance, his left leg swinging out. A searing, white-hot pain shot up from his calf. He let out a sharp, involuntary gasp, a sound immediately smothered by the oppressive foliage. He stumbled clear, his heart hammering against his ribs, and leaned heavily against the trunk of a tree. He looked down. A dark, wet patch was already spreading rapidly across his trousers. With grim resolve, he tore away the fabric. A vicious black thorn, thick as his finger and cruelly curved, had gouged a deep, ragged gash in his calf muscle. The wound was ugly, bleeding freely, and already contaminated with dirt and fragments of bark. In the suffocating humidity of the jungle, Keelan knew this was more than an injury. It was a death sentence waiting to be carried out by fever and infection. Keelan stared at the seeping wound, then at the humid, suffocating air around him. Speed was a weapon, but a body poisoned by infection was a broken one. Pushing onward now would be a fool's gamble. The message, the revolution, would die with him in some anonymous, fever-soaked ditch. He had to trust the old knowledge. He had to fight. Gritting his teeth against a wave of nausea, he began to move, his eyes scanning the undergrowth not for threats, but for medicine. The pain in his leg was a raging fire, but he forced his mind into the cool, calm space of memory, to the lessons his grandmother had taught him. He ignored the broad, easy leaves and looked for the specific heart shape of wild betel, la lote, whose peppery scent could fight inflammation. After a tense, limping search, he found a patch. Nearby, his fingers dug into the earth, pulling up the gnarled, vibrant orange of a wild turmeric root, a potent cleanser. He found a small, defensible hollow between two granite boulders. The next part was agony. He flushed the gash with a precious amount of his drinking water, his knuckles white as he scrubbed the dirt free. Then, using a flat rock, he mashed the leaves and root into a thick, fragrant poultice. He packed the pungent paste into the open wound, a fresh, chemical fire that made him gasp. It was the pain of cleansing. He bound it tightly with strips torn from his shirt and collapsed back against the rock, vulnerable and hidden. Now, he could only wait and trust the medicine of the earth. As darkness consumed the hollow, the fever took hold. Seelan's world dissolved into a cycling torment of shivering cold and searing heat. The rhythmic chorus of the jungle warped into a distorted, menacing drone. He was no longer in the verdant labyrinth. He was adrift in a sea of sweat and memory. He was standing in the sun-drenched market of Oakhaven again. The air was thick with the comforting scents of noodle soup and frangipani blossoms. He saw his little sister, Mai, her laughter a string of silver bells as she chased after a stray puppy, clutching a small wooden starling he had carved for her. The memory was so real he could almost feel the warmth of the sun on his face. Then the sun vanished. A great, unnatural shadow fell over the square as the invaders' iron vehicles growled into the village. The air filled with the stench of diesel and fear. A tall officer with a face like chipped stone strode towards Mai. She froze, clutching the wooden bird to her chest. With a contemptuous sneer, the officer snatched the toy from her grasp and casually crushed it to splinters under his heavy boot. In his fever, Kalen tried to scream, to run, to fight, but his limbs were lead. He could only watch the silent, shattered look on his sister's face. Keelan awoke with a choked gasp, his body drenched in cold sweat. He was back in the granite hollow, the night still thick around him. The fever had not broken, but it had receded, leaving a deep, sullen ache in his leg and a core of ice in his chest. The dream had not broken him. It had reforged him. The image of the crushed starling was now the only thing he could see. Weakened, but with his resolve hardened to steel by the fever dream, Kalen began his desperate search for sustenance. He moved slowly, his wounded leg a constant, throbbing ache. He was tracking a small forest deer when he saw it. Through a gap in the foliage stood a cluster of stones, far too symmetrical to be natural. It was an ancient shrine, forgotten by all but the jungle itself. A moss-eaten statue of a faceless guardian stood vigil, its stone shoulders unbowed by centuries of rain and solitude. Seelan limped forward and laid a hand on the cold stone. In that moment, he felt a profound connection, not to gods but to his people. He was not just a man walking through the jungle. He was a legacy a continuation of an ancient will to survive in this land. The spirits of his ancestors were not ghosts, they were the grit under his nails, the iron in his blood. That encounter gave him a new strength. The days that followed blurred into a grueling montage of survival. The razor-thorn thicket was followed by leech-infested swamps that sucked at his boots, and then by steep limestone cliffs that tore his hands raw. Hunger became a constant companion, a hollow ache in his belly. The fever sometimes returned in waves, bringing with it the ghost of his sister's face. Twice, he hid motionless in thorny ditches as invader patrols passed mere meters away. He was no longer just a man. He had become a piece of the jungle, gaunt, scarred, silent, and unbreakable. Finally, after an eternity of green hell, on the 37th day, he stumbled through a curtain of vines and saw it. The waterfall, just as the map had described, cascading into a hidden valley. His strength gave out. He fell to his knees as figures rushed from the shadows of the camp. They were thin and wore rags, but their eyes held a fire he recognized. A woman with a commander's bearing knelt before him. Kalen could not speak. With the last of his energy, he pushed the mud-caked bamboo tube into her hands. As darkness swam in his vision, he saw her crack the seal. He watched her eyes trace the maps, the rendezvous points, the plan for liberation. He saw the spark of hope she carried ignite into a blazing certainty. She looked up not at him, but at the faces of the dozen other fighters who had gathered. In their expressions, Kalen saw his own pain, his own loss, and his own undying resolve reflected back. His mission was complete. The 300-kilometer walk was finished. A single man's journey was about to become a nation's uprising. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale. And don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these.